Good afternoon, everyone. I know that everybody's hungry, but I'm going to speak about something that is very sensitive. And first of all, congratulations to the organizers. I think the lineup of the presentations gave me some links to make to the points previously made about AI, open source, and compliance requirements. So as it was mentioned, I work as a compliance officer in AI Solutions Competent Base in Abu Dhabi. So my commute was much longer than yours today, but I took the opportunity to take holiday. So I'm very pleased to be here. And I also, as it was mentioned, I'm doing a PhD about sustainability, energy trilemma, and cultural dimensions, which also has some links to AI and data centers. So what I'm going to cover today is exploring the definitions of open source, exploring definitions and implications of legal and compliance matters, the export controls regulations in the US, which are very relevant to everyone, and a lot of people are not aware of that. Practical case studies, example of violations and policy recommendations. And as it is disclaimed in red over there, views are on my own. They don't represent my employer views nor the university that I'm doing my PhD. As it was already expressed in the presentations earlier, open source AI can bring a lot of opportunities because we would be less reliant on the big techs. It brings a more entrepreneurial perspective. More democratization of data. People say that data is the new oil. I agree with that. But it also exposes AI developers or even companies who are receiving service of AI to potential vulnerabilities, as it was mentioned in the previous presentation. If you are plugging in different open source models, you may have challenge to manage them, and I'm going to explore a few recommendations and a few implications about that in the upcoming slides. I break down the challenge in terms of security, malicious use, ethical concerns. Responsible AI is becoming really important nowadays, where you're dealing, how you're using your technology. Compliance is also key, how you are mitigating and controlling the issues, and export control requirements is very important to understand. That is not only driven by hardware requirements, but any software that is exposed to certain jurisdictions, this software would also be, you need to comply with those jurisdictions. So I'm going to explore more details about that. Yeah, actually, this slide is all about the paper that I prepared for the Turing Institute, where the doctrine, the literature defends that transfer of sensitive technologies is how you are subject to export controls. That's the main purpose of the regulations. And in the US, they are, of course, they are very competitive with China or Russia or sanctioned countries. So this is the main purpose of the US regulations. What people don't know is that nowadays, even if you're not bringing any technology from US, but if you, depending on how you structure your encryption, or how you are, your website is that if there is any link to US, you may be subject to the US export controls, and you have penalties of heavy amount or even criminal liabilities. And the Promethean dilemma that I mentioned here, the DeepSeek model grew a lot, the large language model recently, and they learned with a lot of public or a lot of public data from US technology. There are a lot of investigations about that, but yeah, they developed a large language model with 10% of the investment that the US did. Regardless of political views, this is what the investigation says. So in terms of source control definitions in AI models, the US regulation focus more on model weights training because of it's all about the performance density. When you are structuring technology, the way that the technology is calculated is based on computing power. Computing power means the more parameters you have for a particular technology, the more computing power you would have. And this is considered very sensitive to the US authorities. And not only because of the computing power, but also the dual use, you can apply use for military, dual use with military surveillance or cyber operations. And this is why the US is very keen to control model weights. And this is key for open source models. So here I've also selected a few authors that I've included in my paper, just actually emphasizing what I already said, that is not only the physical transmission. If you provide any remote access or release of source code to foreign persons, you may be subject to certain restrictions. So it's always important to assess the specific classification of the solution. Other authors also making reference to the Chinese developers taking advantage of open source models to develop their own capabilities. And the last point is about legal implications, as it was already mentioned, understanding how you are structuring your open source models, understanding your third-party contractors, their cybersecurity risks, but also there are other risks, intellectual property, privacy, and confidentiality, which are actually different than the ones that I'm exploring today, and they could be subject to another paper, and I would be welcome to explore papers with anyone who is interested in explore that. So, as I said before, export controls are the way that national security basically is mitigated, and especially the US, they are so passionate about this because most of the high computing power technology is coming from the US. As I can say that because I work in an AI solutions company, and most of the technology is coming from NVIDIA or AMD, or even when it's not coming from US, the US has a jurisdiction, for example, over Taiwan. So the AI chips that have the best computing power, they are subject to the US restrictions. And I have a practical case study of British provider who were not aware of the US export controls. So basically, they had a US technology they wanted to offer to us, but they re-exported this technology from the UK and wanted to re-export to us. They would be subject to penalties if they didn't get the US license, and they were not aware of that. So basically, in this slide, this says exactly that. It's not only the transfer of technology from one country to another, but also the re-export of one technology from one country to another, or even between the same different legal entities within the same country. So if this is considered a control technology, which is usually because of computing power, performance density, encryption functionality, you may need to consider an export control license. And if it's a control technology, you may need to impose a Chinese law to have a regulated environment where individuals of certain nationalities wouldn't be allowed to have access to this technology. This is just a very high-level summary on the purpose of the regulations of export controls. As I said, it can involve software, hardware, or even any other commodity, for example, oil as well is subject to them. In terms of due diligence, it's recommendable to understand the purpose of a particular technology, where it's going to be deployed, who are for what's the purpose, who will receive them, and how it will be used. So for the purpose of open source, the how is extremely relevant because, as I said before, there is something called AI orchestration that you can just add different models and somehow you can lose which model or which functionality was provided from which provider. And coming back to what Salim said, it's really important to understand who are or what kind of cybersecurity provisions are being placed to prevent vulnerabilities. One example of export control penalty was to Microsoft that they have a control technology, but they still didn't comply with sanctions regulations. So there was exposure to a sanctioned party, and they received a penalty of $3 million because of that. In terms of the latest regulatory position, the US, since the Trump administration assumed their mandate, there was a promise to replace this regulation, which was supposed to happen in May. So what happened was the Biden administration's regulations were formally rescinded, but until now there is no regulation published. So because of that, the previous regulations is still in force, even though it was declared rescinded. So it's a very interesting geopolitical scenario, and for lawyers it's quite active to ensure that we are complying with all the latest position on the regulation. Here is just another article that Microsoft is declaring that every last minute change in this regulation can affect the competition of the US. So companies are exploring to have other solutions or hardware from other countries or from China, because the US export control license are taking a lot of time to be issued. So in terms of policy recommendations, they are slightly combined with what Salim's recommended. As I mentioned, the AI orchestration is key to be properly managed and understood, because open source providers, whilst they are extremely helpful to ensure a more entrepreneurial approach, to have less reliance on big techs, they also expose risks. So constant risk assessments, even cybersecurity red teaming, API access controls to certain individuals, have a more collaboration between the community. There is a global initiative called Global Partnership on AI, the GPAI, is extremely relevant to understand open source models and manage their risks. This is actually not mentioned in my article, but I saw this after the article was published, that there is an interesting discussion between what is a software bill of materials and procurements. Usually open source models, they are not subject to procurement requirements because they are very dynamic. They are just plugins into different technologies. So I find it interesting the software bill of materials, because they allow to still understand what are the controls, the components of the open source applications, and still understanding them, even though usually open source applications are typically not subject to procurement requirements. So these are the key points I wanted to make. I'm very happy to address any questions, and anybody who wants to explore more collaboration, feel free to reach out.